You mentioned Christianity. That was one other big component of his rule. What was the role of Christianity in Constantine's life, in the lives of the citizens of the new Roman Empire?
At this stage, Christianity doesn't yet have a role. It actually took when the emperors took it on board, that is, they made it a part of the imperial system, then it began to acquire a role within this system. Previously, it had imagined itself as having its own history, like not necessarily part of the empire or affiliated with imperial power. But after Constantine, it does acquire a role.
So it's actually one way to ask that question, which is fascinating, because you said that there's Rome, and then there's like cultures like or traditions like Christianity, or being Greek, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to ask this question is: did Christianity triumph over Rome, or did Rome capture Christianity?
Right. Yes.
Which is the mechanism?
I would lean more toward the second. In other words, that the religion was co-opted by the imperial system. Now, there are many areas in which that's not the case and where the opposite happens. So I'm not going to be absolute about it. But I think it's very important to recognize that, because Christianity generates this narrative of triumph, right? Which modern historians perpetuate. And it's framed in very particular ways. In other words, that Christianity triumphs over the ancient religions, right? So displacing Zeus and Apollo and all of that, and animal sacrifice is gone. And like that's because Christianity triumphs. And that's a very narrow way of looking at it. In other words, you pick your enemy and then you can defeat that enemy, right? But if you look in the other direction, there's like the Roman imperial state. And you cannot say that Christianity either triumphed over it or even tamed it or anything. It actually became part of it in many ways that determined its history for centuries and, in fact, down to today. So this is very different, for example, from the history of Islam. So Islam comes into existence without a pre-existing state to receive it and take it on board. It creates its own state, right? So the Muslim armies, they conquer this empire, and then they have to sort of govern it. They think according to whatever Islamic principles. The Quran doesn't say anything about running an empire. So that creates a completely different society, right? Where like Islam is really a primary kind of identity and like drives a lot of developments. But Christianity comes into existence within a very well-developed society and political system. Now, here's the thing. We don't know exactly how many Christians existed in the time of Constantine. We speculate maybe 10% of the empire. That might be very high, right? But even if it's 10%, it's not a lot. And these are not like elites for the most part. Maybe middle, what we loosely call middle class, a few elites, a few slaves, like this kind of thing. Mostly urban. And keep in mind, most of the population is rural, right? So pockets of concentrated, Christian groups in cities. That's what we're talking about. Not terribly politically powerful.
So Constantine's conversion to Christianity and moving the empire towards Christianity is not something where it's a gigantic majority of the people, or it's a political convenience because it's the elites. It's something else. Right. I mean, pretty revolutionary decision, I would say.
Exactly. Now, there used to be theories that Constantine did this for like pragmatic, cynical reasons, that he like wasn't a true Christian or anything, but there was some kind of political gain to be had here. But I have never read a convincing account of what exactly that political gain is. We now know that there are fewer Christians. They were not that influential. You can make an argument that bishops are a kind of convenient social influencers, you might say. Like you can use those. They're not a threat to your position, right? So a bishop is not going to try to take the throne. So they're not dangerous political operatives in that way. But they do have some influence over sectors of society. And so that might be okay, I see that. But I don't quite see the argument for like going full Christian just to get the support of some bishops, who actually pretty quickly turn out to be, some of them, more trouble than they're worth. Anyway, so I have not yet seen a convincing political argument for Constantine's decision, which means that you then fall back on a personal explanation that he did this because he was a believing Christian, right? And he came out, in support of the religion that he held. And that's kind of where most scholars are today. Though, I got to tell you, historians are very uncomfortable about personal choice, like explaining history in terms of these kinds of personal choices. Because Constantine's conversion is it's massive. It opens the door. It incentivizes so many people to also convert. Because Romans will generally do what their rulers will tell them. If we've mentioned Hadrian a few times, he had this lover, Antinos, Greek boy from Bithynia, who died in an accident in Egypt, whatever. And Hadrian said basically that Antinos should be regarded as a god throughout the empire. And he was. We have more statues and busts of Antinos from all of these temples all over the empire than I think of anyone else except Hadrian. So yeah, if the emperor says this is a person is a god now, put statues of him everywhere, they will. And when Constantine comes out in favor of Christianity, suddenly people discover that, this is an interesting, right? It's got the support of the emperor.
So one of the things here, going to the Perplexity, Constantine's conversion to Christianity is usually dated to 312 AD, linked to a visionary experience before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Do you believe that vision, that he had this religious experience before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge? Here it says, but historians debate both its nature and its sincerity.
Well,
do you believe the sincerity of that experience?
Before we even get to the sincerity, it's the problem of the sources. This is reported by authors writing later, in the aftermath of a victory, when the emperor, one of them had a dinner conversation with the emperor a few decades later, and he said, well, let me tell you about the Milvian Bridge. And it's okay, I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to take that at face value, rather. It's a much more complicated. This is how the emperor wants things to be remembered. That's different. Also, Constantine tended to have a lot of religious visions. He had religious visions of Apollo before Christ, and we have sources that talk about that too, that he went to this temple in Gaul and Apollo appeared to him in the form of light. Okay, Constantine has a religious vision every time he kind of wants to shift policies. And his profile, when he wanted to break away from his other emperors, who used to go for they went for this kind of Jupiter-Hercules model, and he shifted to an Apollo model. This is branding. This is emperors doing branding.
So we should say that, as you've described, Constantine is a pragmatist. He's very pragmatic. But you're saying it's fair to believe, based on the evidence, that he actually converged towards being a Christian believer.
Yeah, it's very possible. In fact, plausible that he thought the Christian God had helped him in battle. And, for someone like him, that's as good a reason as any to support that God.
But he was not a hardcore Christian all the way through. He was a kind of a spiritual, religious kind of person. He thought about religions more generally and just converged towards Christianity as a good religion. He also had ideas about what a good religion is and what a bad religion is, that kind of stuff. So he's thinking in this space.
He's tending not to be too explicit, depending on the audience. So Constantine remains a pragmatist in the sense that he doesn't want to alienate too many of his subjects, right?
Fair.
And so he's sometimes a bit coy or elusive about what he's getting at. When he's talking to Christians, he will talk about Christ. He will mention Christ. When he's talking to everybody else in a general law, he'll just refer to good religion. And it's maybe you know what I mean, right? But he's not going to come to Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So even at the time when he's supporting the church, basically institutionalizing the church as part of the imperial system, but he's also putting up statues of himself that look like Apollo in Constantinople, right? So the focal point of Constantine's Constantinople is the Forum of Constantine, and in the middle is this very tall column, and it has a colossal statue of Constantine on top, gilded, enormous thing. I don't know, 8 meters tall or whatever. But it's a repurposed Apollo. It's even visibly so. It's naked. It has the rays coming out of the head, right? And everybody knew it was an Apollo. So that's Constantine in the guise of his old patron god Apollo. But it's still Christian Constantine. So he's sending all of these different messages.
I mean, he likes being the godlike figure. I mean, that whole statue is I am the god.
Yeah, it's assimilating yourself to, yeah.
And I mean, a lot of the Romans, is it fair to say, kind of saw the emperor a little bit in that light?
Oh, yeah, they called him divine, and
Yeah.
there's not a hard theology there, right? Like, if you pressed them on the actual theology, they wouldn't say the emperor is a god. No. This is mushy. This gets very, very mushy.
But I mean, a lot of the Christians have a kind of humility before God.
Yeah.
I think when you have an emperor that's godlike, it gets a little weird.
Yes.
In the way you talk about God.
It depends on the context. Like, there are contexts in which you are an emperor and you're proclaiming your majesty. And then there are more personal contexts where you might be more humble because, I don't know, you're being baptized or something. Like, those are different contexts.
So can you speak to the whole process of the conversion to Christianity, of the propagation of Christianity throughout the empire, and Constantine's role in that?
Constantine, or his successors as well, because this was a gradual process, and it takes a very long time. So let's put it into perspective. We probably can't talk about a majority Christian society until maybe the 5th century or early 5th, mid 5th. We don't have data, obviously. And we can't talk about like a solidly Christian society until early 6th century. And by solidly, I mean maybe where the non-Christians are 10, 15%, right? So that's a long time. That's like 5 centuries after Jesus. That's half a millennium. So we're talking about a half a millennial process here. It's very long.
But it's only a couple of centuries after Constantine.
Yes.
So it takes about 2 centuries to really make the Roman Empire Christian.
Yes. So very slow conversion, maybe up to 10% tops under Constantine. Then obviously larger and larger groups join the church, even if only nominally, right? Until you get to the 6th century, when you're clearly talking about a mostly or overwhelmingly Christian society. A lot of this is just done through incentives and disincentives, right? So bishops are given funds with which to distribute like charity and help to communities in distress. They have lists of widows and whatever they support. Land is given to the church by the emperors or in wills so that they can engage in this kind of social policy. And then there are disincentives. So emperors pass laws that increasingly restrict the exercise of traditional religion. Like, you can't perform animal sacrifices, then you can't start doing these like tying ribbons to make wishes, or like all of these things, like going out to sacred trees and doing this or that, because they say, oh, this is kind of nefarious business or like magic or whatever it is. And then they just gradually start outlawing it more and more, putting restrictions on, like, if you're not a Christian, you can't hold these high offices, or there's problems with your wills. So they gradually do it like that. And this is how and it works. It works.
What explains the success of Christianity after Constantine? Why was it, as a technology, so successful at spreading throughout the empire?
Christianity developed in a number of ways. So it acquired a certain number of forms that were capable of appealing to different constituencies. In other words, there was an intellectual side to it. The sort of theology, the almost the quasi-philosophical or engagement with philosophical schools that could draw in, let's say, intellectuals. There is a public ceremony and ritual aspect where you can organize communities and cities to have processions or like have all these festivals that take the place of the ancient ones. You have a kind of it's not secretive, but it's kind of this initiatory aspect where there's this baptism and you learn a sort of creed and you're initiated into the religion with the prospect of a personal afterlife, right? And that appeals to other kinds of people. There's also ways in which it integrated itself into the court and the language of power. Also in the army, right? Soldiers now swear an oath to the Trinity, right? So it takes all of these different forms that enable it to position itself, here and there, and, in the streets, in the court, in the armies, in the churches, in texts and books. And so it has this kind of manifold diversity, right, that makes it very adaptable.
So one of the things you mentioned that Constantine did not anticipate, did not realize that Christianity creates divisions between various groups.
So in part, this happens when you have religions that make exclusive claims, right? Like my beliefs are true and yours are by definition false. Not just wrong, but false and even kind of evil. Like maybe Satan put them in your mind to lead you astray, right? And this is inherently divisive, like it is. So there's this paradox where Christianity, in contrast to, say, the ancient religions, is both far more polarizing, but also far more powerful as a unifying force at the same time, right? So ancient religions tended not to produce this kind of conflict or identities, right? Or wars or these kinds of things. And they could under certain circumstances, but for the most part, they were not drivers of history in this kind of way. But when you have exclusive claims, then suddenly these very communities that are sort of consolidated and have this very strong identity, but you also alienate other groups that you then are in conflict with. So this is why I for one, can't come down on whether Christianity is more of a unifying force or a divisive force in the history of the Eastern Empire, because it's both.
And also trying to figure out whether the unifying or the divisive aspects are a feature or a bug. Maybe some of the divisive elements is a way for society internally to try to, much like the civil wars, to try to figure itself out. So sometimes tension and conflict is a good mechanism for figuring out what do the people want.
Or what's the truth.
Or right? What's the truth.
Yeah. So the story that it likes to tell itself is that there's this one original truth, and the hardcore of true believers is defending that truth at every moment against all of these evil heretics who are coming in and trying to corrupt it. In reality, what happens is that this truth is something that's evolving in the course of the controversies. And like often they don't know that they believed that until in retrospect, once they've had the fight and the winner has this position. Oh, now that turns out to have been the position we always held, right? And this happens again and again and again. A lot of the time, these Christian theologians who get into so much trouble and get branded as heretics and sometimes get sent into exile, they didn't mean any harm. They often just were stating what they thought everybody believed. And then when they blurted out, someone is like, often Alexandria is like, what? That's heresy. And then now you're in trouble. Now you're getting into this fight, and you might win, you might lose. But like a lot of them were kind of sort of well-intentioned in that way, or they had no intention of starting a fight. But there's always someone who wants to start a fight.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the fights are extremely intense over things that I could see on the surface, or like iconography. It's like it seems like a very subtle debate, like almost academic, and then a large number of people don't see it as academic. They do see it like the devil put ideas in your head that are completely wrong, and it's fascinating how that kind of division can emerge. I mean, the impossible question, and I apologize for asking it, but maybe it's just worthwhile to try to think about it, is on the grand scale of centuries of the East Roman Empire, is religion a constructive or a destructive force for the empire? Did it help it flourish, or did it hold it back?
This society identified itself increasingly with what it saw as orthodoxy. Orthodoxy just means correct belief. I mean, like every religion ultimately thinks it's orthodox, right? But that's the conventional name, right? Orthodoxy today might be called Greek Orthodoxy. And I mean, it's such an essential part of the culture. It really is. I can't think of the two of them I mean, I try to, because as a historian, I have to test the models, and try to see these things as independent of each other. But ultimately, it's very difficult to disentangle them. And I would say that to the degree that this is a successful society historically, that its religion definitely contributed to that and played a role in it. Not without cost, right? It mattered to them. They valued it. But things that matter to you have a cost. And they paid that price. They were willing to pay that price for it. For example, at the very end, they had to choose between Catholicism, Western rule, where they essentially have to compromise on their faith, or rule by Muslims, the Turks, where they would not have to compromise their faith. And some of them were explicit that they were preferring option B, because the Turks will at least respect our identity. Like, that's a cost.
Yeah. But there's other layers like taxation and the functions of government that are connected to religion to the degree it interacts with the tax system. But it feels like that's the engine of the society, and religion is more like the cultural layer.
Yeah. So this is why I said that I try in thinking of the models that we use to understand the society, not to assume that religion is everywhere and for everything. Now, I have colleagues who do that, and I would disagree with them about this, but you're exactly right. There are elements of this society that I like to see as their own thing, like the Roman identity, for example. It's not the same as Orthodoxy, but also the operations of the state. Those are very pragmatic things, and you see them intersect with religion largely in areas of terminology or the vocabulary that they use, or, like at the top, but not at their actual functioning. So in my field, I'm a historian who's tried to promote other aspects of the culture as having the kind of integrity of their own, and not to subsume them all within orthodoxy.
So, I mean, again, an impossible way of asking the same question. If you asked a Roman, 1 million Romans across 1,000 years, are you a Roman or a Christian? What would be the answer for them?
Both. Oh, absolutely.
No, you don't get to say both. You're not allowed to do that.
Why not? It's the true answer.
Okay. So you're saying they're really tied together.
Well, they overlap, but if you were to, and this might be a somewhat more subtle conversation than most of them would want to have, but if you were to say, is Roman and Christian the same thing to you? If they thought about it for a little while, they'd quickly be able to say no, because there were, just logically, there were Christians who were not Romans, the Bulgarians or the Rus or, whoever. There were lots of Christians who were not Roman, and they did not regard them as Roman just because they were Christian. Conversely, they knew perfectly well that there had been Romans who were not Christians, and they knew this how? Because in the churches, almost every week, they celebrated martyrs who had been killed by the Roman emperors in the past. And there was like the performance of violence by Roman emperors against Christians was like something they remembered, they knew perfectly well. So those two things did not overlap perfectly. And there were some contexts in which you would be more Roman, and there were some contexts in which you would be more Christian. And you find characters who, and I love to do this, I find characters who, as some sources say, we didn't pay too much attention to Christian things. Like, there's just politicians, they were just doing their work. And then you find characters who like devote themselves, they go all in on orthodoxy and like monasticism and things. They just don't care about the Roman stuff at all. And that is in fact part of the reason why I like this society, is because it has these kinds of options for people to choose. And there's another one. There's the Greek stuff too, because their language is Greek, their literature is Greek. And so there are people in the society who go all in on the Greek stuff, right? And I see this society as this kind of laboratory of these three elements coexisting in these fascinating combinations. Usually it's combinations, right? But sometimes you'll find people who are like kind of try to be purists in one way or another. And it's the only society in history in which you can do this, because it's the only society that's Roman and Christian and Greek, but in different ways, right?
And unfortunately, I think it's tempting, but it's probably impossible to say if we remove the taxation system, would Roman Empire be more or less successful? If we removed religion, would it be more or less successful?
Right.
If we removed Greek and kept it Latin all the way through, would it be more or less successful? It's probably impossible to do this kind of analysis because they're all so deeply integrated.
And fundamentally, it also wouldn't be what it was. it would be something different.
But there is a big temptation, and this is at the core of your work, and to understand why did the East Roman Empire last as long as it did? And why did the broader Roman Empire last as long as it did?
Yeah.
Because it is one of, if not the most successful empires in terms of duration and stability in a very tense part of the world.
That's actually like my next project. I'm starting to write a book trying to explain, just kind of from a analytical standpoint, why.